in the country in the Panhandle. She and my grandfather raised cotton and cattle for many years close to Wellington. We called her Mamaw. A train track ran close to Mamaw's place. I was visiting of a summer when I was 7 or 8, looking for adventure. I was bored. The cousins had gone home. The chickens were fed. There'd been a little work in the garden. The afternoon draws out. I told my Mama I was going for a walk, and she said, "Stay away from the train track. There's men out there walking, and don't you talk to them." Now, I heard those men aren't your neighbor. They're other. They're not like us. Good admonition to a 7-year-old who knows no stranger. Now, I was of the same composition then that I am now. The first thing I did was head toward the train track. I climbed up on it and walked on the tracks. Then I heard a train coming, and I shot off those tracks into the ditch. The engineer waved at me, and I was very excited for him to know I'd seen him, and I jumped up and down, waving back. And suddenly, there he was, the other, the man who's not like us, the one who is not our neighbor. He was walking up the track, and he waved at me too. I shot in the field as fast as I could go, headed to my Mama's house, and I didn't look back and didn't slow down until I got to the chicken coop. There I stood, catching my breath, daring to look behind, knowing that I was in shouting distance of salvation, calming myself so I could approach the house nonchalantly without giving away my adventure. Those people aren't like us. Jesus has turned his face towards Jerusalem. He has foretold his death. He has sent the 70 out to pray and heal and teach, and they have returned joyful at the possibilities. Then a lawyer shows up. Now, lawyers are something like Pharisees. The Pharisees were terribly concerned about the status of Israel's relationship with God, and they believed the solution was in following the rules in all of their affairs with devotion and perfection. They often challenged Jesus because his disciples did not follow the letter of the law. And Jesus often responded that it was not the letter, but the essence of the law that was to be followed. Lawyers do seem that they have something of the same relationship to rules that Pharisees had. So this lawyer approached Jesus to say, "How do I get this eternal life thing you're talking about?" And Jesus says, "What does the law tell you?" And the lawyer replies, "The law tells me to love God and to love my neighbor as myself." Jesus says, "That's it, you got it." And the lawyer says, "Yeah, but who's my neighbor?" He wants a specific and detailed roadmap. Which one of these people am I required to love? And so Jesus tells the familiar story of the Good Samaritan. Now remember, 2 weeks ago, Jesus had visited the Samaritans, and they would not receive him because he was on his way to Jerusalem. The Samaritans were people who had claimed the same heritage from Abraham and Moses as the Jews, but they had broken off from the Jews about the time of the exile to Babylon. Rather than worshiping in Jerusalem, they claimed Mount Gerizim as the true place of worship. So 2 weeks ago, the disciples wanted to rain fire on those Samaritans because they wouldn't receive Jesus, and Jesus rebuked the disciples. And so today, the priest and the Levite walk on, and it is the Samaritan who stops and cares for the stranger. And Jesus asked the lawyer, "So who is the neighbor?" And the lawyer says, "The one who showed mercy." And Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." In In the last speech he made before he was killed, Martin Luther King spoke from this parable. He wondered why the priest and the Levite didn't stop to help the injured man. He speculated that maybe they were on their way to a very important religious meeting in Jerusalem. Or maybe they were on their way to Jericho to a meeting of the Jericho Road Association, which was going to address the issues of the robbery problems on the road. And they didn't want to stop for an effect. They wanted to address the cause. Then Dr. King says, but I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible that those men were afraid. You see, the Jericho Road is a dangerous road. I remember when Mrs. King and I were first in Jerusalem. We rented a car and drove from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and as soon as we got on that road, I said to my wife, I can see why Jesus used this as the setting for this parable. It's a winding, meandering road. It's conducive for ambushing. You start out in Jerusalem, 1,200 feet above sea level, and in 15 or 20 minutes later, you're at 22 feet below sea level. It's a dangerous road. In the days of Jesus, it was known as the Bloody Pass. And you know, Dr. King said, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over the man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible they felt the man on the ground was merely faking and acting like he'd been robbed to lure them there a quick and easy seizure. And so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? When one of my sisters was old enough to drive, but not old enough to drive the 3 hours from Lubbock to Wellington, she had a fight with her boyfriend and she took off in the car to go to our Mama's house. Mama's house was that kind of place. It was a refuge. Outside of town, my sister ran out of gas. A man in a pickup stopped. She was too scared to open the door. He called my Mama and he said, I think one of Virginia's kids, Virginia is my mama, I think one of Virginia's kids is out there on the road. He could tell by looking at her. She was a stranger when he stopped his pickup, some kid stuck at the side of the road, and she was his neighbor because she was stopped in a car by the side of the road in his town because she looked like his kids and all the kids who'd grown up there. She was neighbor by virtue of years of relationships and helping each other, tilling the land and building houses and going to church and looking after each other's children. That's what happens in a small community. And he asked himself, if I do not stop to help this child, what will happen to her? I always talk to my mama about what I'm going to preach. When we talked about Dr. King's response to the gospel, she said, well, the question is, what will happen to me if I don't help this man? What will happen to me if I keep on walking down that road? Last week, our Muslim brothers and sisters began celebrating Ramadan, which is their major religious observance of the year. I often feel uncomfortable meeting Muslim men because they don't touch women and they avoid the eyes of women, and I'm used to handshakes and eye contact. 2 years ago, I met a woman, a person who was in the process of a change of gender. I often felt uncomfortable around her. I was distracted by her differences. I didn't feel comfortable asking the questions that were always on my mind. Our church here is close to 100% white in a neighborhood that is 50% Hispanic, Black, and Asian. I wonder why people of color haven't found their way through our doors. People who look different from us. People who may need our help simply to be safe in our communities. If we don't stop to help when there's a need, what will happen to these people in our neighborhoods? Will they be safe? What will happen to me if I turn away from them? Years after my mama's death, I heard this story about her. During the Depression, lots of men walked those railroad tracks, and you could see her house from the tracks. She was a small woman, a tiny woman, who supported her parents during the Depression with her egg money. My papa was often in the fields working and tending the cattle. These men, these hungry strangers, would come down to Mama's door. She would always open the door. She would always find them work to do. She always had food for them. If I do not help this stranger, what will happen?